Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that will have you coming back for more. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get to the main event, as a reminder for those who are on YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes of the podcast. Also, we're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all the audio platforms. So make sure you subscribe there as well. And for those who would like to help us continue building this platform, we do accept donations, either one-time donations through the following platforms, whether you have Cash App with the handle $IDTALK4ED, Venmo with the handle @Kwame SM, and then PayPal with our URL, paypal.me/Kwame SM. We also have a community on Patreon. So if you're looking to learn more about the Identity Talk community, get some behind the scenes footage, early access to future episodes of the podcast, become a patron today so you can get those exclusive perks that no one else in the public is getting. And then, of course, to catch future and past episodes of the podcast, you can go to our main website at IdentityTalk4Educators.com. And for those who are looking for a new book to add to your library, we have Learn to Relearn, Supporting Identity in the Culture-Affirming Classroom, which is coming out next month. You can pre-order your copy today on Amazon or go to the Routledge website to get that pre-ordered copy. And to learn more about the book and access some free learning resources, you can go to the book's main website at learningtorelearn.com. So make sure you do that, people. And as always, thank you all for the support. All right. So today's guest is somebody who's also a fellow Stenhouse author. I got a chance to connect with him a couple years ago when he was at that same stage as I was, looking for a new place to get his book published. And I gave him a few pointers and some direction there. And fast forward 2 years later, he's got this amazing book out called Heart at the Center, An Educator's Guide to Sustaining Love, Hope, and Community Through Nonviolence Pedagogy. And this is an amazing read, a read that every educator should have, especially educators who are all about centering the humanity and identities of students and those who are involved in this thing we call education. So I want to bring on someone who is an award-winning beatboxer, an educator. He's a father, husband, author, obviously, and he has so many roles and does such incredible work in his community. So without further ado, I want to bring on Mr. Mike Tinoco to the podcast to talk with us about his book, his life, and what he's currently doing right now. So let's bring on Mike. Hello, sir.
What's up, Kwame? Hello. Thank you for having me, brother. I appreciate it. And for the lovely introduction. Happy to be here.
Yeah, happy to have you here and congratulations on getting the book out. I know when we first connected a couple years back, you were just trying to get some direction, and here we are having a conversation about this amazing book, which I'm excited to dig into in this next hour. But of course, before we do that, I do want to give you a chance to just share a little bit about yourself, upbringing, and how we got here. So I know I read a lot of it in the book, but for those who don't have the book yet, so I'll give you a chance to just share a little bit about who you are.
Yeah. Well, I live and teach in San Jose. This is home for me, originally where I'm from. And growing up, we moved around quite a bit. And I think like the lack of having sort of stable roots contributed to this sense of just being kind of unmoored, like just not sure where my sense of home or community is. Compounded with that is the fact that growing up as a mixed race kid of color, there was some confusion about who I was once we moved to out of state. We were living in Oregon for a few years, and the confusion stemmed largely from not being able to speak Spanish, which is the language that 3 of my grandparents spoke, but my parents weren't taught it. And as a result, we weren't taught it. So I was one of few brown kids in a lot of my classes. And it was really like the first time where that was like pointed out or where I felt like I didn't fit and I was just made fun of a lot. So school was not a place where I felt affirmed or valued. And I really struggled socially in Oregon. I mean, I had like a couple of friends, but I just didn't really feel like I belonged anywhere. So I started to get into some trouble, like really searching for kind of a group that I can just hang out with because it was hard to just be by myself a lot. And then there were some problems at home happening simultaneously. So I was just getting into a lot of trouble and then eventually was sent to return to California to live with my dad. This is like the end of 8th grade. And I really needed that. My dad was able to provide the kind of presence and stability that I was yearning for. But school was still a place that I just didn't see value in because I was still experiencing a lot of some painful things, like I was being bullied and I was just associating with some kids who I think were also wounded like myself, but just like creating a lot of toxic energy. And I didn't have the strength to walk away from that. And so I really was at a low point sophomore, junior year. And then I discovered beatboxing. And for those who don't know, beatboxing is the art of making percussive sounds and sound effects with the mouth. I'm not sure if the microphone will pick it up. I'll try a little sample so listeners can see what that is. So that's beatboxing. Did the mic pick up any of that?
I heard everything.
Okay. So when I discovered that, or when I came across it, because I didn't discover it, but when I came across it, my mind was just blown away. And I just wanted to learn it. I wanted to practice. And Rozelle is the beatboxer who I heard
From the
way
roots.
back from the
Yeah.
Roots. It was like 2001, I think, when I heard his album. And I just got fixated on it. So long story short, beatboxing in many ways kind of saved me. It provided me with a creative outlet to one, express myself, but two, eventually I was able to begin performing little small rallies at my school, but also like outside of that. And I was able to connect with other artists. And I had a high school teacher, it was my keyboarding class, who would just take time to kind of recognize what I was doing in class. Small things like, hey, Mike, great job on your typing test or whatever. So that in conjunction with the beatboxing was contributing to like a deepened self-esteem and confidence, and seeds were planted for possibly becoming a teacher. And I remember very vividly, I have this memory, it was like my junior year English class. The teacher, sweet guy, just had a really hard time like kind of holding the space. Like it was just pandemonium. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, perhaps arrogantly, but I remember thinking, there's got to be another way that like this stuff can be taught. This isn't it. So I remember thinking that. And so I was telling myself like, well, like if you were going to be a teacher, what would you do? How might you do it differently? And I didn't have an answer, but the seed was planted. Eventually, after graduating high school, it took me a couple of years before I was ready to go to college. But once I was, teaching was the thing that I really wanted to give a shot. Here I am.
Yeah, because I know in the book, after you finish college, you are performing with a beatbox community, right? If I'm not mistaken. So were you touring before you going to college? How was that working?
So actually, I started to beatbox performing when I was still in high school, like right at the end of senior year. That's when I was first
Okay.
performing like in San Francisco. And that community of beatboxers, it started to grow and grow. I think that first performance I was at, there was maybe 10 of us or something, and a lot of teenagers like myself, a couple guys in their 20s, but we just stayed connected. And so it was mostly shows that we were doing in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Berkeley, occasionally Oakland. And then concurrently, I was kind of doing like my own thing. I was performing just in other areas. I got to travel overseas a couple of times with another beatboxer from Canada. And the community in the Bay Area was like home base. We had like monthly shows we would do together. And occasionally some of us would collaborate and like do something beyond the Bay Area. So that lasted through college and a little bit after I graduated.
Awesome. So this is the part that I was trying to figure out. You go through most of your K-12 schooling looking for that sense of belonging, whether it's at home or at school. You find it through beatboxing. So my question to you is, what was it about beatboxing that propelled you to now be motivated to do better in school? And I'm also wondering, how come you weren't able to find that in those years prior to you discovering beatboxing? Was it teachers? Was it just the curriculum? What was missing?
It's such a great question. I think part of what was going on for me was that one, like I wanted to learn, and I didn't have that awareness at the time that I was a student. Like I wanted to learn, I valued learning. It's just like what school was offering just felt so disconnected from like the pain and trauma that I was enduring and had endured. There was just a complete disconnect. And my teachers were like well intended. Plenty of them were nice, I had a few like with really questionable approaches, but by and large, like they were nice folks. But that wasn't enough for me to engage and kind of buy in. I just did the bare minimum to appease my dad about attendance and passing grades and such. I think what beatboxing offered me was the humility to like really suck at something and to have to learn, like you got to figure it out. Like if I want to sound like some of these professional guys, like that's going to take a lot of practice and consistency. I think I just really enjoyed that. Even if I didn't necessarily know at that time that like the beatboxing was going to take off into anything, like I just was really enjoying this way of expressing, occasionally collaborating with other beatboxers, because there was at least like one or two at my school where like we would occasionally perform at a rally together or just do it during lunch. And like that just felt great. It was just sort of a shared language without words. You think of rappers who were ciphering, freestyling. There was kind of like that spirit with the beatboxing, just creating something organic. So perhaps the same could have happened like with DJing or with breakdancing if I had gotten into those things. But beatboxing was the thing that just really appealed to me because I didn't have to like go buy equipment. I can just do it like wherever. And so there was something really nice about that too, where it's like, I don't have to like have stuff. I can just do it at the library, on the bus, or wherever.
Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of hip hop culture, just the improvisational nature of it. They can do it what you have in order to create something innovative and beautiful and be right within that culture, man. So that's an incredible story. But I want to go ahead and fast forward. So you discover beatboxing, you performing on stages, you eventually go to college and you do get a teaching credential or license. So now we're in the classroom and we know that during that first year in the classroom, we're still trying to figure out who we are. I went through this. I know you went through it, and we're going to make mistakes. Perfection is not the goal. We're going to make a lot of mistakes. I know for you, you were very transparent in the book about some of the mistakes you made. And it was around that time when you were just trying to search for answers. So at some point, you discovered the power of nonviolent communication and how that could be something that could be beneficial to the students in your class. So let's start there. Let's talk about how you came across in it and what was appealing about the philosophy. And we can get into the layers because I know there's many.
Yeah, appreciating the question. I think I'll start by saying that my first year in the classroom, I went into the first year with this idea that was ingrained in me from my own experience as a student, but then also from what was communicated at the school, that you got to maintain control of the kids. Like you got to be in control of the classroom. Like that just wasn't really questioned. It was just assumed. My teacher education program, like there was a little bit on classroom management, but I don't remember us going like really deep into that. So I went into that year like thinking, okay, well, I guess I got to do everything I can to maintain control. And a fellow colleague, really nice, well-respected guy, he said very plainly, he's like, hey man, in this community, like you don't smile till Christmas, right? I know teachers probably hear that, but like that's what I heard. And so I was like, okay. But there was something about that just felt so inauthentic to like who I am and how I try to be in the world. So I was trying to sort of have this authoritarian approach and telling the kids like first warning, second warning, all this stuff, like these kind of tiers of responses if kids like break rules or whatever. And it just didn't work, man. Like the kids could just kind of see through that. I think they didn't appreciate someone trying to kind of micromanage their behaviors. And I think what was making it difficult for me was I give a lot of credit to my dad for how he raised me. Like I try to live and move through the world with a lot of open-heartedness, treating people with compassion. And so I was trying to like have this authoritarian approach while at the same time I'm like trying to like love the kids. And it's like there was just like a paradox there that I was having a hard time reconciling. So thankfully, after some like real stumbles, I just let go of this attachment to this idea that like I have to control the kids. And they responded so well to like my shift. I talk about it in the book, like really rather than trying to be in control of others, I was really being in command of myself, like occupying this internal space of like, I want to have clarity that like, I'm not here to control other human beings. I want to create conditions that maximize learning and that center joy, because the kids were responding particularly well to sharing our stories, poetry, narratives. Like a lot of kids would be really vulnerable. Some of them would cry and others were just like cheering each other on. So like it felt really magical and beautiful. And I wanted to continue to like figure out like, how do I create with the kids a space that's really grounded in this kind of sharing, this kind of humanizing sharing, and kind of authoritarian holding a tight grip on the space just didn't feel like it was conducive for doing that. So how did I get like exposed to nonviolence? Well, the seeds were already planted years before. Like my dad, as another, to reference him again, like he just modeled for me so many times of like, we don't have to respond to conflict by escalating the conflict. Like I have examples of like when he would just creatively turn things in a different direction, like diffusing a situation just like that. So I was really curious about what felt intuitive in many ways to me, like showing up with this kind of open-heartedness and really like genuinely caring about the kids. Like I wanted to find a way to articulate it better to them, but also have clarity for myself around how can this help me better teach like the content and have tighter sort of a methodology for how the content is taught, aligned with a clear purpose, a vision of like, why are we doing this? So the what, the why, and the how. And I remember hearing like early in my teaching career and in my teaching program, like talking about love a lot.
Yeah.
Teachers always talking about the importance of loving our students. And like that felt like a no-brainer to me. But I really wanted to study like, okay, but like what does that mean? And how can we actually practice this where our pedagogy is in alignment with that and not
Mhm.
undermining this ethic of love? So one of the voices that was popping into my head was Dr. King, because I just remember hearing him talk about love, but I had a very shallow kind of understanding of what that meant.
We all
So I
did.
just sort of did a deep dive and I started really studying his sermons and speeches and like just reading a ton of his writings. And I was just blown away by how he was characterizing love as a force that builds community, that it's something grounded in action. It's not just sentiment. From there, I just did a deep dive. And it was around that time I got exposed to nonviolent communication. I was like searching for workshops. I was searching for spaces where I could like learn in community. And I came across this week-long retreat in Northern California that was about nonviolent communication. So this was like early, I don't know, I'm 3-4 years into my teaching at this point, where I was searching for something to like help me be the teacher that I really wanted to be, a clearer sense of like how to walk in the world, move through the world in the way that I really wanted to. And so I was craving tools to help me with that. I could say a lot more about NVC, but I want to make sure I'm answering the question as you're answering what you had asked.
No, you are good, brother. You are good because there's a lot of layers to it. Even as I was
Mm-hmm.
doing my own reading of it, and that's why I'm so glad you're here. But I do want to talk about the concept you talk about of negative versus positive peace because you were alluding to that even in some of your examples. And as I was reading the chapter, you won't believe this, but my youngest son's name is Xavier. That's my youngest son's
Mm.
name. And as I'm reading the story about how you were, I think a student of yours was trying to read something from, your document camera. So it's a whole class lesson taking place, and there's of course talking in the back. So typical thing that happens in every classroom. I've dealt with that a gazillion times. Usually it's a redirection. All right, please, we stop talking. We have a classmate that's trying to do a reading. We do a couple redirections. They kind of brush it off, and then you get frustrated because now you feel like, oh, my authority is being undermined. So you stressed. You got all these kids who are expecting you to address the situation so that you can move forward as a class. And sometimes we don't have the best day. Sometimes we react in ways that are just unbecoming. And I know I've done that on a number of occasions, especially early on in my career. But that was something that I was like, yeah, I think every teacher can say that's happened to them more than once. But the part that you talked about was how you wish you had taken time to get to the context of the behavior, the source of it. Why is this student having a rough time? Is it something happening at home? Did something happen in the previous class? Because that tends to happen, especially when students are transitioning from one class to another. We don't always get the opportunity to just pull them to the side and find out what's going on and do that deep dive because we have a lesson we have to teach. We have kids here. But I'm wondering with the negative versus the positive piece, as you were applying that with students, did you start to think, man, these are things that I still got to address in my own life? Thinking about your trauma, thinking about figuring out who you are and all the things you mentioned. I'm wondering if that was something that you connected with on a personal level.
Yeah, definitely. It may be helpful for listeners if they're not familiar with negative, positive piece.
Yes.
That distinction is something I learned from my homie mentor, fellow nonviolence trainer, Kazu Haga, many, many years back when I was first learning about Kingian nonviolence, which follows the tradition of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and one of his associates, Dr. Bernard Lafayette, co-created this whole conflict reconciliation curriculum with another activist, David Jensen, shortly after Dr. King was assassinated. So in terms of like in the classroom, like what do we mean by negative peace, positive peace? Negative peace refers to this idea that we may have a ostensibly quiet or orderly space, but there can still be tension that's like palpable. And those things, the orderly space, the quiet classroom, whatever, like sometimes that can come at the expense of student wellness. So for example, like that student Xavier, and that wasn't his real name, by the way, when I had him escorted out of the classroom, because I called the office, kid was acting really disruptively, I got a quieter classroom. But it came at such a cost. My relationship with that student was severely strained. It did nothing to improve our rapport. And as I write about, like the kid was humiliated, like crying in the office. And I only know that because the assistant principal came up to me. She was like, what happened in there? So yeah, negative piece is this idea that we have sort of Band-Aid solutions. We're kind of sweeping things under the rug. We're not really getting to the core of the issue. And Dr. King talks about negative peace with the example of authoring Lucy, who was the first Black student to attend the University of Alabama, and how she was kicked out when white students were all up in arms because she was just trying to go to her classes. So when she was suspended and the campus was visibly quieter, like local newspapers said, things are quiet in Tuscaloosa, there's peace on the campus of the University of Alabama. So Dr. King like just lambasts that whole idea. Like that is not real peace. That is a negative peace that's coming at the expense of justice. And positive peace sometimes is loud, sometimes is messy, sometimes is disruptive. And I give a couple anecdotes of the unsung hero, Shiro, Mary Hamilton, about like what does positive peace look like. So I've come to actually really honor moments of disruption. And what I mean by that is like if a kid is doing or saying something that might like be like going against what I'm trying to do in the moment, I'll try to identify like what are the needs behind that behavior. And I've become really skilled at being able to do that where it's not this big power show. It's like not a showdown in front of the class. And sometimes it can be subtle stuff. Like if a kid is, say, on their phone or maybe like listening to headphones and I'm like trying to facilitate a conversation or something. Like if I can be attuned to what are the needs behind that behavior, that can help me, one, maintain the relationship with the student, and two, like figure out what strategy do they need in order to access the learning, or is there something else deeper going on? Positive peace also invites, well, more than invites, it validates righteous rage, righteous indignation. And I think sometimes kids can respond to things that they consider to be unjust, maybe even oppressive. Like we've seen some viral videos of students like confronting teachers who maybe are saying sexist, racist things. And like, to me, that's positive peace, where the student is trying to verbalize something that they consider unjust. But even like the seemingly innocuous things, like the behaviors that we might not consider righteous indignation, things that we might just consider, this kid's just messing around, like they're just disrupting or they're disengaging. It's still, I feel a responsibility to try to tap into like, what are the needs behind that? I know we haven't talked much about that yet, needs, but that is a central part of nonviolent communication, which is a dialogic model. It's a consciousness practice, which posits that all human behaviors are attempts to meet needs. So if I can have that frame when I'm engaging with my students, I'm less likely to sort of be reactive and clamp down on stuff. And if a kid is doing something that's really egregious, there needs to be put a stop to it. Like, yeah, of course. But I don't have to try to rule the space with a firm grip, with like an iron fist. Like, can I be attuned to, can I empathize? Because the kids really respect and appreciate that. They will try to mirror that kind of energy when they see that that's happening with them. I'll pause there. There's more I could say. I just don't want to get lost in the weeds about that distinction between negative, positive peace.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at IdentityTalk4Educators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at IdentityTalk4Educators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. Yes, and then with regard to the NVC model, nonviolent communication model, I know there's the 4 parts. So you mentioned needs, but even before that, there's also
right.
the feeling as well. So you have to see what's going on, assess the situation. You need to be able to figure out what feelings are coming out, what feelings are manifesting. And then we get to the needs as you articulated. So there's a whole protocol that has to happen. So it's not so that you really get a sense of, all right, so what is it that we need from each other? And I think a lot of it is about the need to repair harm and restore peace, whatever that looks like in that context. And I think that's something that gets overlooked, especially with the different policies that we have in place in our schools, whether we're talking disciplinary policies, zero tolerance policies, is all about, okay, we just need to punish students as opposed to getting to the root cause of the behaviors that are taking place. And I think to a certain degree, it impacts the way that we view classroom management, because we're taught that we should do X, Y, and Z, but it's not ingrained in what you just described. And that's a lot of teacher training programs. So I guess for me, what does a teacher do in a situation where they are implementing this philosophy in their practice, but it's not in alignment with what the school does or how their colleagues think? Because I think that could lead to some disconnect and conflict down the road.
Such a great question, man. I mean, I'll use myself as an example. Like, I, to the greatest extent possible, try to make requests of my kids and not demands, unless there's like something harmful, which is like so rare. But like, if there's something that's just like not okay, okay, we need to put a stop to that, right? But generally speaking, like the spirit of how I try to engage with my kids is through requests. Because no human being likes to be told what to do, especially when it's received in like very demanding language. It's an invitation for resistance. But I think making requests also honors people's sense of choice and autonomy. So for example, like one of the big ones right now is around cell phones. So the request there is to please use them with discretion, mindfully, and responsibly. Well, and there's a lot to unpack there. And I've had a lot of conversations with the kids, particularly early on in the year, of like, well, what does that mean? So I gave some examples of like, here are some times where I would be okay with and actually would encourage you to use it. Like if you're writing and you find it helpful to listen to music, if you're a emergent bilingual learner and need to look up words to translate, things like that, like please feel free to use it. And then of course, like if I'm teaching something or we're engaging in like group discussion, class discussion, or community sharing, like those are times where that won't meet my need for like honoring like sharing of stories and stuff. And so that degree of transparency, I think the kids appreciate. And for the most part, man, like the kids are great. Yeah, there's a few who struggle and need a couple of reminders. There's been a few where I've called home, and I'm transparent with the kids too before that. I'll be like, hey, I'm noticing that you've been using it excessively, or I saw you using it a little bit more than I'm okay with. I might reach out, call fam just so I can get some support. Are you okay with that? Usually the kid's like, all right, yeah, because you already checked in with me. So it's not about punishing the students. I'm very clear about that. And man, this kind of tripped me out. Like last year and a little bit this year too, I asked a few kids, I was like, hey, I'm noticing like you're struggling with the phone right now. Would you like to put it in my desk? Would you like me to hang on to it? Are you willing to put it in your bag? And there were a number of kids who were just like, here, just take it, Mike, hold on to it. And that was like, I appreciated that because I genuinely wasn't trying to coerce them to be like, hey, give me the phone. Like I was putting it in their hands. They recognize like that's one strategy that would help them to maintain presence and just to make sure they're actually learning. For folks who are kind of hearing this and wondering like, man, like you're being way too lenient, way too lax with the kids. By and large, the students, they're cool about it. Like they know if I'm talking, if I'm bringing this back, they're going to take out their earphones. They're not on their phones. But even for the kids, like the few who really struggle, I'm trying to model for them and create with them an alternate way of being in the world that's not grounded in like punishment and rewarding and coercing, but that's dialogic and it's messy. This approach, it's not like a perfect, pristine approach. I want to be clear about that. Like there's times where it's like, oh man, I wonder for the teachers who have the pouches and the kids right when they come in, like how much easier is that for those teachers, right? But I'm really trying to honor like the mess and to just be in that space if it allows for me to maintain strong rapport with the kids, honors their sense of choice and humanity, and creates a different paradigm, a different way of being. Instead of teacher holds all the power, kids are just relegated to the sort of bottom, do as I say. And the last thing I'll say before I hand it back to you, the past couple of years, I've asked the kids, like at the end of the year, I'll be like, okay, y'all, now that we've had a whole school year with like these requests, and the cell phone is just one of many. The cell phone one, like I'm really curious how they feel about that, having done it for a whole year. And last year, I think it was like 99.4% or whatever of the students said like they really appreciated this approach and they would say, please do it again in the future. So, and then I asked them to explain that too. So it wasn't just like a number, but there was like an explanation for that, right? These are like the quote unquote high achiever straight A students, everyone in the middle, and some of the kids who were like really struggling in school, like consistency just across the board. So I don't know. I'm trying to like honor that. And it's not lost on me, like the research on phones and mental health and schools that like have zero phone use. Like I'm aware of that, and I'm trying to see how this approach can be viable in the midst of all of that. And I'm definitely an outlier in my own school, but I wouldn't say there's conflict with other teachers or admin. More than anything, some of the kids are just not used to like, yo, Mike, this is very different than what we're used to. So yeah.
And I appreciate you for even saying that. But I want to backward design what you just described for a second. I want to get back to the beginning of the school year, because what you talked about was how you managed to develop, well, co-create a culture of safety, a culture of respect, and in some cases, vulnerability within your classroom. You didn't do that by yourself. You invited the kids at different points of the school year to help you in that process. So I want to talk about that beginning of the school year, because typically there's always, for a lot of teachers, especially the ones that we grew up with, we go into the classroom first day and there's already a list of rules. Usually they're written not in the affirmative. It's usually like, do not blah, 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 do not blah, 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 raise your hand, very generic. Now, let's say you have a new class of kids coming in to your classroom. I'm assuming that's not the approach you take. You take a very different approach that invites students to provide input on how they want the classroom to run, what kind of culture they want to have shaped. So could you tell us, I know it's a lot, but briefly, like what are some of the things that you do to help shape that culture that you just described?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I've shifted away from just even using the word rules. Like I think I was using that maybe year one, year two
Yeah.
even, but like yeah, so that's just not something I use anymore. The requests are coupled with this philosophy, this vision, and that is the principles of a warrior scholar, which I talk about in depth in my book, chapter 1 or chapter 2. And for listeners who are unfamiliar with that, that's a concept that I learned about from reading and listening to Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade, an educator based in Oakland, and these kind of sets of principles, like this kind of way of being that he calls the definite dozen. And I was really inspired by that. It was something that ran deeper than just like grades and academics and college goingness, but really spoke to like the core of who we can be as people and strengthening character. So I was inspired to like try to come up with something that one, I could hold myself accountable to, and two, like help the students aspire to be like their best selves, even on days when we're not feeling our best. Like just honoring, like sometimes we're just not going to be our best, and that's okay. But can we have something that's sort of aspirational that can guide us towards something beyond just reading, writing, literacy skills? And so the principles of a warrior scholar that I've sort of developed over the years are the following: love myself and others. My thoughts, words, and actions can build or destroy. Discipline myself so that no one else has to. I'm in control of my own life. Stay committed and grow. Never ever give up. Speak and listen with an open heart and mind. Honor differences and see people's humanity. Be of service to others. Help people succeed and thrive. And the last one, fight for what's right. Be on the side of justice. So I tell the students at the beginning of the year that this is a vision grounded in love, humanizing ourselves and each other, and that it's grounded in nonviolence. And I tell the kids that over the course of the year, like we'll be looking at stories and sharing our own stories, centering our own stories as a way of like practicing these things. And that I want to model and work with them in creating a way of being that honors all of who we are, and that they're not rules, but that it's an invitation for us to aspire to be part of something larger than ourselves. And overwhelmingly, like the kids gravitate toward that. So we say it at the beginning of class every day. We'll frequently kind of revisit them throughout the year, like, hey, which ones do you feel like you're able to practice, which ones are you struggling with? And I tell them that like I myself reflect on these regularly as a teacher, as a father, to be mindful about like, how do I want to be in the world? And I feel like there was another piece of the question you were asking about, like early on, how do I co-create this space with the kids, right?
Yeah,
Or
like what does that process look like? So you mentioned the principles that you've developed for the Warrior Scholar, right? What I'm wondering is, are there moments where students are sharing their own interpretation of what those
mm,
principles mean
mm,
to
mm,
them? How's that
mm,
apply in this current classroom context? What would that look like
mm.
in our community this year?
Yeah. So when I'm introducing it, I do ask the kids, like, what does it mean to you? Like, what does the word warrior mean to you? What does the word scholar mean to you?
Mhm.
So we start with that. But the principles themselves, I am clear with the kids, like, this is something that, like, I am kind of holding. Like, I do want to get their input on it, but it's something that I'm asking us to try to hold together. So it's not something we're like co creating together. What we're co creating together is the space itself and opportunities where the students are willing to, like, be vulnerable through sharing of stories and a bunch of other things. The
Got
principles
it.
themselves, though, feel pretty foundational. And I had a great conversation with a fellow educator about this very thing some time ago, because I part of me was like, well, should I be creating principles from scratch with the kids? Like, and I think it's both and, right? Some teachers will do like classroom agreement posters with their classes, and like that's great. I'm also thinking about where I was at when I was in high school. No vision, like completely not, didn't have a lot of self-awareness. So if a teacher were to ask me like, well, what's your vision, like what's important to you in the world, I would have said, I don't know. So I think I would have really needed a model, a guide for something for me to kind of be invited to be part of. And that's how I'm holding these principles of a warrior scholar with the kids, and that it's grounded in needs. So I tell the kids that I'm like, throughout our time together, I'm going to try my best to attend to our collective needs, heart needs, intellectual needs, community needs, right? Like, so that it's not just privileging the head. So I don't know if that offers a little more clarity for that question you were asking.
No, that definitely helps. And just for those who are listening or watching, we also know that we have 180 plus days in the school year. Things
Mm-hmm.
happen over the course of a school year. Context changes, things happen. I would assume needs change over the course of time. So are there checkpoints throughout the school year where, all right, let's check in with each other. How are we doing in terms of honoring these different principles of the warrior scholar? How are we doing as a class? How are we doing individually? Just giving that chance for self-reflection and seeing if there's any not modifications, but tweaks that we need to make in order to ensure that we're meeting the standard.
Definitely. The kids will do reflections periodically at the end of a unit. Sometimes we'll do really quick feedback slips. That's what I call them at the end of a week. I tend to go really heavy on like asking the kids to self reflect on the needs that are being met or not in the space. And I'll offer them like a checklist. They have a list of needs in their notebook and a list of feelings in their notebook. We look at that frequently. And so, for example, like the question might, or the list of needs might say, like, the question might say, what needs of yours are being met currently in our space? So I might have like safety and security, belonging and connection, learning and growth. And so it's helpful for me to see like, okay, where's the kind of collective, the needs that are being met and what, if any, are like not being met. So that informs me about like what I can do, should do, we could do differently. And that's helpful to know like what are the things that are going well? What are the things I might need to change up for the following unit? Yeah. And the same thing with the Warrior Scholar principles too. If a number of kids are saying that they're struggling with being of service to others, for example, okay, well, that tells me that I need to be more intentional about structuring opportunities where they're like actually helping their peers in their groups or whatever it could be, but just creating those opportunities where kids can practice it so that it's not just words on a document or on the front of the classroom, but it's something that's showing up in how we are behaving and acting with one another.
Yeah. And I do want to make sure that we talk about a chapter in your book, Heart at the Center. I think the
Mm-hmm.
chapter that I love the most was the one where you talk about cultivating self-love.
Mm-hmm.
And the The reason why is because so often in the school year, when we start a school year, for some teachers, they want to jump right into the academics. But then we have those who want to go deeper into the stories of students. Like, I want to get to know you outside this classroom. Like, what's your life like? What are some of those experiences that help shape who you are as a person? And you had a whole lot of activities that helped you to get some deeper context about who your students are, which I thought was so powerful because I don't think that's something that is commonplace when we talk about how we start a school year. And I'm thinking about just self-love as a concept because I know in my case, it wasn't until my late 30s that I discovered therapy for myself, way to some of the trauma that I was with my attached to my father and things that happened in my childhood, because I saw how that was impacting me as a parent, how it was impacting me as a husband. And I'm seeing how important it is for students to have ownership of those stories that are told from their perspective and not someone telling the stories for them, and how that can help to shape that classroom culture. Just talk to me about the importance of self-love as a way to shape that space of belonging for students in the classroom. Because I think that was a really important chapter that people need to get some more context on.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of circling back to what some of what I was sharing earlier about like my first year, like the one of the strengths from that first year, something that kind of came more easily to me was creating these opportunities for kids to share their stories. So I knew that that was something I wanted to never compromise, but to like keep as a foundational piece of my teaching. And in the years since, like that has remained a constant. I think what kids really crave, even if they might not necessarily show it or they say they don't like to share, like kids are craving spaces to be seen and heard. And part of that entails like sharing our stories. And so over the years, I've been just experimenting with different types of writing that lends itself to vulnerability that really helps strengthen our capacity to share with others, but like gives us permission to be ourselves and not have to wear masks, not have to shy away from like who we are. Cause I just think about the wounded young person that I was and how reluctant, how scared I was to like take off this mask of anger and bad behavior. And I think if I had had a space where a teacher could create a kind of container with the kids where like the stories we're going to share are like going to strengthen who we are and who we can be, like I think I would have given it a shot, but that was just non-existent. And I think today, like I don't really hear love outside of maybe like social justice spaces. Like I just don't hear that word used a lot amongst teachers around like, well, what does it mean to center an ethic of love? How do you cultivate that with for our kids so like they can really practice it so that it's not just something like the teacher is doing, like, oh, I'm just going to love my kids, but how do we actually do it where the kids can love themselves and love each other's humanity? So yeah, like you referenced already, there's a number of activities in the book that give some examples of how to do that. For the kids who are a little resistant to it, oftentimes I'll listen and I'll empathize and I'll just say stuff like, oh, it sounds like it's really hard for you to share. It sounds like maybe it's something you're not used to. And sometimes like I'll just ask them a question like, what does it say about schools that you haven't been provided with opportunities to share your story like this before? Because oftentimes when we're about to share something, especially if it's like more vulnerable, kids will say like, well, I haven't shared anything like this before, or like, I don't like to talk about myself. And so I don't judge that. I empathize with it. But when I ask them like, well, what does it say to you that like you haven't been given the chance to do that? Invariably, they'll look at me just dumbfounded, like, oh, I don't know, I haven't thought about that. And so I tell them, like, I'm wanting us to disrupt this idea that school's a place where like your story is invalid or something. Like, what does it mean to only read other people's stories and to not treat your story, to not center your life as text? Like your life is the curriculum in this class
Mm.
just as much as other stories we're going to read. So that idea of life as text is paramount. And for the more reluctant kids, like over time, they come to really appreciate it, and vast majority of the kids are on board with it. But it takes a lot of strategic planning. It's not something you could do in week 2. There's a lot of easing into creating a space where like kids are willing to share some of the heavier things, but also like joy. Like joy, we have to create opportunities to center that too. That is also a part of self-love, which is like, I'm going to celebrate the things that I'm into, right? Like I want to celebrate the things where I've achieved something or my hobbies or whatever it is. So giving those kids those kinds of opportunities where it's not just like heavy, but it's the things that make them feel alive too.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Wow. And I'm thinking about how we talk about social emotional learning, we talk about trauma informed practices, but
Mm-hmm.
yet we engage in actions that are antithetical to the spirit of those concepts. You mentioned love. You don't hear that word love spewed often, but yet we talk about the importance of social emotional learning. We talk about all these things, culture responsive practices. All these things require love, everything. So I was just thinking about that as you were going through, as you were sharing this story. But the counter stories are so important. Just there's so much power to the counter story. Even when I do this podcast, every time somebody comes, I'm excited to learn about their story and how they got to where they are. There's a power to these narratives. It's powerful because it's the student that's having the agency to share their story. No one else is sharing it for them. And there's a power there that I think gets overlooked sometimes. And you mentioned this too, because you were an English teacher. So I know over the course of a school year, you got to do different types of narratives, different types of essays, some that are a bit more academic than others that don't really give you the opportunity to share about who you are, but you're either doing some research or having to respond to a different type of text, giving your own interpretation of it. So I appreciate you for even sharing those activities, but also providing access points for students to be able to engage with the activities. So it's not just written, kids could draw pictures, they could record interviews. There were a lot of different options that you provided for students, because we know that we have students who are emerging bilinguals. They may still be
Mm-hmm.
building English proficiency. So maybe recording might be the way to go. You have some who prefer to draw. They like showing their artistic side. So I appreciated that. That was my favorite chapter to read through.
Mm.
Yeah, man.
Glad to
But
hear that. No, thank you. Oh yeah.
yeah. Now go ahead. Go ahead, please.
No, it just there's one thing that came up for me that I'll just briefly speak to, and I think it
Go
actually
for it.
might connect to one of your earlier questions too. Is around
Yep.
like I'm thinking about new kids who come into this space who aren't there for like the foundational beginnings, right? And so I have like a couple new kids who just joined, and I make it a point that when they enter this space and they're seeing like everyone's saying these warrior scholar principles and all this stuff, like the mindful breathing at the beginning of class, like they just might not be like used to that. Always like, of course, introduce myself, but give them a quick sort of overview of like what is this space about, like what are these warrior scholar principles. And if when it comes to like sharing a narrative or something or a poem, like always trying to ease the kids in as opposed to just making them feel like, hey, this is what we're doing and like you got to be about it, because like the new kids didn't ask to be there, like they're there. So always trying to, like you said, access points. I'm just thinking about like if we get a kid in October or in May, like always trying to like just honor like where's the kid at that moment, and then hopefully like helping them to like see value in the space and wanting to be part of the community that we're building together. And that's an ongoing thing, like because it takes time. It's something that you care for. It's not just like a one and done, cool, like I shared the slides, introduced it, it's like no, it's like a plant that you got to water, take care of it. Yeah. So the self-love piece, it's like it's a practice. And I hope that listeners feel maybe inspired or encouraged by our discussion, because there's a lot there that I try to offer, whether you teach math, PE, like it's not limited to just English class, the humanities, but it's something we can and in my opinion should be doing regardless of our content area.
Right. It's very much interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
Every teacher in the school is a literacy teacher. I don't care
Yeah.
what area you teach. I was a math teacher all my years in the classroom, and we incorporated literacy.
Mhm.
Speaking of stories, in the beginning of the school year, I used to have kids write a mathography. So, like their
Mm.
math story. Tell me what your experiences are with math. What are some of the traumas that you experience? Give me a positive story of when you felt successful doing math. What are some things that you look forward to learning this year in math? So, yeah, we all incorporate literacy in some shape or form. So, it's all of us. And we could talk all day, brother. There's so much to talk about in this book. I mean, I'm holding it right now. For those who are listening to us, we're talking about just over 300 pages of rich content, 300 pages of very incredible stories of students who are resilient, stories that you share about your life and how they've led you to where you are today, talking with me. And once again, I told you this off air. I appreciate you for writing this book because this is such an important book. And I really hope that people do get a copy of it. So I'm going to just hold it up right here. And I want to finish off our conversation with this question, which I ask everybody. How do you stay true to the teacher in you?
I love that question. One of the ways is, I think, getting feedback from my kids regularly about what's working, what's not. What am I doing that is helping to meet needs? How can I grow? So just trying to be in a place of humility, always being a student myself, learning. One of my favorite shirts says always a student, and that's like a philosophy. It's like I try to model that and be transparent with the kids about like, where am I trying to grow? What am I interested in learning? What am I doing not related to teaching that's helping me learn and grow? And also just the practice of reflection. I have a daily reflection that I fill out every day at the end of my teaching, where I identify for myself, like, what am I celebrating? What are some areas that I want to grieve and or think about what I can do differently for next time? And just being connected to community, that helps me to not feel isolated, and that inspires me to keep going, keep doing this beautiful struggle of teaching.
There we go. And then finally, Mike, just let people know how they can connect with you. I know that you're a Kingian nonviolence trainer, so you do provide support for teachers who want to learn more about the philosophy and how they can apply that in their classroom. So you can share a little bit about that, but also for those that just want to connect on a deeper level about what you do. The floor is yours,
Yeah,
sir.
absolutely. The best way to contact me is probably my website, just miketinoco.com. I'm also on Instagram. I have a modest Instagram page. Mike, not Mr. is the username there. And yeah, if folks have questions about the book or just nonviolence, feel free to reach out to me. But this book really does explore a kind of holistic way of engaging with nonviolence through the content we teach, relationally, self-collective care, and even navigating working through conflicts with colleagues and creating community with colleagues. So yeah, hopefully I can connect with some of your listeners. I appreciate everyone for listening, and thank you so much for having me, brother. I appreciate it. And I thank you for the thoughtful questions that you asked.
Yes. And for those who don't have a copy, get Heart at the Center right now. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on the Rutledge website. Any book retailer that's out there, you can get a copy of this. So make sure you add this to your library, please. Man, Mike, thank you so much. And on behalf of Mike, everybody, I want to wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.
Peace out.